The field of mindfulness has many problems, but very few are as seen and unnoticed as a lack of diversity. Whether it's in our teaching spaces, our supervision, or the places where we learn, we are not representing the global majority. Hi, my name is Ted Meissner, and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. And today we're going to be taking a look at some of the ways we can be more inclusive and equitable in the field of mindfulness. Please do remember to tap that subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. Come on, let's get started. Our guest today is Abraham Dejene. Abraham, welcome to the podcast, and so glad you could be here. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time.
Thank you for having me, Ted. I've been also looking forward to an opportunity to have such an important conversation.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that in a moment. I do want to ask you to maybe say a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do.
Sure. I'm Abraham Dejene. I am a teacher and teacher trainer at the School of Professional Studies at Brown University. So I teach MBSR and teacher training around MBSR. Then I do some adjunct work for UNC School of Medicine, and then some independent work within different sites across the country and then sometimes across the globe, as well as we do some work in Africa as we bring mindfulness and movement to these communities.
Great. Thank you for that. And one of the things I wanted to start with in this conversation we're going to have around diversity, inclusion, equity, these kinds of issues that we're finding within mindfulness and yoga is a little bit about your story and you getting to where you are now. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit about that too.
Yeah, absolutely, Ted. I think, like most folks, there's often some catalyst to what brings us specifically into this work, often directly around our own healing, which then maybe expands out to being of service to others. So for me, this was maybe in 2012 where I had just finished up my MBA and I thought I was going a very particular route up the corporate ladder, only to realize within like 9 months of being in the workforce that this just was not going to fill my cup in the way I wanted to be in relation to the world. So I was studying Buddhism and Eastern philosophy at that point in time. And then I just sort of took the risk. I didn't have much in terms of like belongings, family, and things of that nature. So I decided to move to Southeast Asia, to northern Thailand, to be more specific, and Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, to really have an opportunity to deepen my practice and to see how that would support me as a human being. And then through that experience, especially being raised in the inner city where things like violence and resources are quite challenging, I thought about like, how can I bring this skillful way of being in the world directly into my community that desperately can use it as a way to alleviate stress, as a way to alleviate grieving, as a way to be in relationship with one another that isn't always so often predicated on being under-resourced. So it felt like, yeah, I had sort of a aha moment of like, how do I come back to the US? And then how do I bring this really beautiful gift from Southeast Asia over in a way that is digestible for my community? So that's a little bit about how I got into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're spot on with the idea that so many of us who come to these contemplative practices or movement practices, whatever they happen to be, that there's something in our lives that triggers that. Either there was some difficulty that our coping mechanisms aren't quite cutting it anymore, or just an inclination towards something that's a bit different. And I'll say congratulations on the discovery that it only took 9 months to get out of something that didn't feel right for you. And some of us, it takes a bit longer. So I'm so glad you got through that fairly quickly. And I'm wondering about in that trajectory of finding that there's another way of being and running into different cultural contexts from where you started in your life. What were some of the things that you noticed as you got more into mindfulness than in a Western culture and setting? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I'll say I think when I first transitioned from Southeast Asia back to the States, I had this whole grand idea of trying to bring that lineage and that practice in a very similar way to the way I experienced it in Southeast Asia, and that just didn't translate to my community. So I quickly realized that if I'm going to offer something, if I'm going to be in service of others, I need to be able to meet them where they are. And that is something that has been really challenging in the mindfulness world, in this Western sort of Eurocentric lens that we look at this practice through, which hasn't been really digestible for the global majority. And so a lot of what I've noticed over the past, I guess, almost coming on a decade of bringing this work both in the yoga space and in the mindfulness space as well, is this desperate need for us to meet people where they are. And that looks very different depending on the community that you're working on. And I just also want to mention, sometimes when we talk about the global majority, and sometimes BIPOC is a term that's often used as this umbrella term to describe different communities, which in some ways robs the diversity even within that community. So how do we, yes, just for language purposes and for ease of speaking, it may be easy to say global majority, BIPOC communities, but in some ways that really strips the diversity out of it. And then once again, we're back to the starting position of really treating this massive portion of the world as one single culture. So just, I'm also quite aware of how that begins to really position these communities in a way that doesn't actually speak to them, just because we've given this sort of broad label across a training or a class offering.
Yeah, if we can stick with this for a minute, because Abe, what you're raising is such a critical point that it's not just one monolithic culture that's all the same, whatever it is. We're even in a same location, like a particular city,
Yeah.
even people within who may identify in a particular way still have radically different cultures and views and perspectives. And you're right, by just looking at the book title, we're not going into the full depth of what's in those pages and the wonderful rich diversity that can be part of that. So I'm curious about some of the ways in which this may have shown up for you is when you're engaging with a particular set of people or individuals. How do you learn a little bit more about what their perspective and their cultural context is? What do you do to learn about that?
No, that's a great question, an important one, Ted. And I'll give maybe two concrete examples to highlight how I've been able to work with these communities who I don't necessarily understand or comprehend based on my own lived experience. So I worked with a mostly Kenyan group, and I was bringing MBSR to them. This was in the States, but they're mostly immigrants recently have entered the country. So a lot of their Kenyan identities were still a big part, and that included religion being at the center of their lived experience. And yes, I am Ethiopian, so I do have an African, East African background. Yes, I am a person of color, and at the same time, very little understanding of the specific Kenyan community. So if I went in there like, oh, look, I'm from the African diaspora, I'm a Black man, so by default, I should be able to comprehend this group, would be really an error in judgment and a little bit of ignorance on my end for sure. So what I did in that specific case was I teamed up with someone in that community, which served as sort of this gateway between me and them. So they can really inform me and educate me around what's important for them, what resonates. How can I really shift this curriculum in a way that speaks to them versus what I think they should have to listen to? So that really, so when I went in there to offer, and this was an in-person offering for an 8-week program of MBSR, I was really, in a lot of ways, able to meet them and then also make space, which is where humility can be really important, where I misstep or I misunderstand something, that can there be space for participants to feel comfortable enough to call me in on it rather than call me out. I like to call a me in approach to making mistakes. Or so that felt really, and allowed me to connect. And I'm still in relationship with these folks, which historically, mindfulness in the African community is a struggle. Religion is a tremendous resistance to it, but having that information and then having that person from the community really educate me before I even went into the classroom felt like an important key piece. And similar to the project that we're doing in Malawi now, where we're bringing mindfulness and movement inside a refugee camp. Once again, this was a dominantly Congolese community that has fled the war in Congo. So once again, I'm Black, I'm African. I could go in there and say, oh, I should know this, I should understand this because of my background, but I know nothing about the Congolese experience, nothing about Congolese experience of folks who fled war. So once again, teamed up with somebody on the ground, spent a considerable amount of time with them in advance of teaching the class as a way to be educated and what will work, like what kind of trauma sensitivity do I need to bring in based on their lived experiences, which really revolves around trauma, whether it's sexual or violence. So those like entry points and being humble and saying like, yeah, I don't actually know much here. Like you are the expert in the room of your lived experience, and what can you offer me so I could be of service to you has felt like a really meaningful relationship. And it hasn't felt extractive in nature, Ted. Like here's what I'm able to offer, and here's what I know, and here's what I don't know. How can we work collectively to make sure that we are showing up as instructors, as facilitators in a way that is conducive to your community?
Yeah, this is such an important part is that it's complex. There are more
Yeah.
than just one thing we need to consider. The
Yeah.
idea of humility. We may be experts in mindfulness, for example, but completely uninformed about a particular cultural need that is very present. And so I am curious from working with different groups. You shared a couple of examples here. What were some of the things in your listening, your learning phase about their needs? What were some of the interesting things that you found that may have been a bit surprising or unexpected that were really inspiring to you about people in their cultures and how they are and what will be helpful to them from mindfulness or yoga, whatever it happens to be?
Yeah, Ted. And, fortunately, as part of my thesis, when I was in grad school at Brown, I did decided to do a focus group and then conduct some questionnaires and some individual interviews as well to figure out like what is preventing people of color, the global majority, from entering these spaces around mindfulness. And a lot of really important information came from there. Some of it was quite obvious because of my own lived experience, and some of it was really inspirational in a way where I haven't really thought about mindfulness. And what I mean by that is when we got into those focus groups and asked questions like, how do we adapt mindfulness to better meet your needs? I'll never forget this response from one participant in that focus group. And she was like, you do not need to adapt mindfulness to us. Mindfulness is something that's been part of our lived experience in a variety of ways. So it's more of how can I position it so it's relatable to ways that they have understood mindfulness. Whether it's like cooking together in community, whether it's drumming or tapping, all the different ways being present has existed in all these different cultures. It may not just look like sitting on a bench and meditating. It may take on a diverse form in nature. So that felt really an important highlight for me. Something now, every time I teach any mindfulness programming, especially if it's a longer course, I spend a considerable amount of time in orientation talking about where this mindfulness originated from, and then also how mindfulness has existed essentially forever, as long as humans have existed. It may just show up differently in your culture. So I'm very specific about like how does it show up in an Arab culture, and once again there's a little bit of generalizing happening here. How does it show up in the indigenous community? How does it show up in the Latin community? How does it show up in the African American community? And then the more I speak to it of things that they already know and they already are doing, it's just they never thought about it or called it mindfulness. That has really helped me to bridge the gap between this practice that often seemed quite foreign to a lot of folks versus like, oh, wait, you mean to tell me like when my grandma was rocking on the chair, like she was really bringing awareness to her own body in that moment? Like, yeah, like there's a variety of different ways this has shown up culturally. And sometimes just to name it, even if that's not what we'll be doing in the curriculum in the class, just to normalize their experience of what mindfulness means to them has really, really, for me, cut the barriers between like, here's this foreign practice versus, oh, this is a practice my ancestors have been doing. They just call it something different and it looks different.
Yeah, and this is one of the key ways in which you can establish really good connections and a learning environment with people is showing them that they already know so much of this from their own personal experience. And that makes it, oh, this is already part of my daily life. I just
Yeah.
didn't know it. I didn't think of it in this way. You also brought, there's something else that came to mind as you were speaking around people who say are teachers, and they're going to be teaching in a setting that may be very different from what they're used to. And we'll do some learning about it, but there may be a difficult bridge to cross in that it becomes somewhat performative instead of authentic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit about just your insights around that, if that's something you've run into or seen.
Yeah, I'm often one of the only person of color in most spaces I land in when it comes to the mindfulness and the yoga space. So I'm often surrounded by white colleagues, Eurocentric colleagues. And this is often a challenge of like, how do I step in without, once again, making myself the center of this experience? How do I step in? How do I ask? So there's a lot of fear and hesitation around that. And often what I tell, especially those are close and near, just near and dear to me, is for them to really find themselves in spaces where they're the minorities. Like go to a yoga class where you're the only white person. Go to a mindfulness class, go to a Black church, go to a Latinx church. Like find yourself as the minority one so you can really understand the experience. Of course, it's not exact because power is still spread out in a very specific way, but I imagine something will happen there for you as you look around the room and you're seeing like, oh wait, like no one in this room looks like me. I don't actually understand a lot of what's unfolding. I can't relate to it, which is really an experience often people of color have on a regular basis when we enter these kind of spaces. So what would it be like to have that embodied experience of being sort of the odd one out, the minority in this space? Because I think that also will begin to inform, like, oh, wait, so these are things that participants in my class are experiencing as one of the few folks of color coming in. So having an embodied understanding of it as you bring yourself into places where you're not the center of attention, I think is this a good starting point. Like, be okay with the discomfort. Yes, I imagine discomfort will come up for you, but if we're talking about this practice of being a practice of meeting ourselves where we are, that also includes meeting ourselves in the messiness of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things a teacher can do is really embrace that experience that is not going to be comfortable, that may not be as supportive, may feel a little uncertain, because that is often what is a global majority feels in predominantly white spaces, at least here in the US and in the West. So we're talking a little bit about some of the hurdles that the global majority runs into in these spaces today. We're seeing that shift a bit. And I want to talk about two more broad topics. One is, what are some of the hurdles? We know some of these around being uncertain, being the odd man out, so to speak, and not being in a space that is inherently more supportive just by virtue of we share a similarity.
Yeah.
We share some common features, common backgrounds, common things. That's one. So what are some of the others? And then another thing after that is, what are some of the opportunities? What do we do to shift this stuff? So let's start with what some of the speed bumps that you're noticing. What are they?
And thank you for that question. I think I'll approach it from two different perspectives. One, from the perspective of participants just wanting to take mindfulness classes, and then from the lens of teachers of color who want to teach, who want to have opportunities to teach, or even get the training needed in order to teach. So I'll approach it in both directions. So in terms of participants, I think we did a really good job of collecting a lot of information from the focus groups. And we had four different focus groups and a few different individual interviews. And across the board, it didn't matter if it was an indigenous folk, it didn't matter if it was a Black or a Latin folk, an Arab folk, it didn't matter what the age or the gender was. Across, the one thing that was consistent was needing and wanting to see folks in this teacher role that represent their lived experience. So diversity in teaching was across the board the most consistent response we received around what has kept them from entering a classroom. When you enter a classroom, you look around and no one there remotely looks like you or potentially could have your lived experience. There's already a wall that comes up for us. Folks of color, there's like this visceral wall that comes up as a way to protect ourselves and doesn't allow us to be open and doesn't allow us to be seen in ways that we would want to be seen if we felt safe enough. So I would say diversity in teachers is really important. Another thing that came from that research was around having material that communities can relate to. Because a lot of what we use, whether it's MBSR, MBCT, or these other MBI interventions, a lot of the material that comes in is really from a Eurocentric lens. So whether it's examples or stories or poems that's being used, a lot of folks from the global majority do not necessarily relate to it. References that are being made in the classroom often is like, what are we even talking about? So how do we work with the material in hand while still keeping the fidelity of these programs, while still keeping the integrity of these programs? How do we make it digestible for people who aren't Eurocentric? So the material that goes in, simple things like poems, simple things as references that we make are important. And then another thing that came across is bringing social events and things happening around these communities into the classroom. I'll give an example of I took MBSR just for myself. I'm like, I need it. I don't need to teach. I need it for myself in 2020. And this was in the midst of the pandemic. It was in the midst of, the Black Lives Matters movement. It was in the midst of all these police killings of Black and brown bodies. And in the 8 weeks of that program, that never came into the room. And I say, how can we talk about mindfulness as this opportunity to look at everything through the lens of awareness? And at the same time, like literally this country is up. I don't know what the best way to describe 2020. It feels like, yeah, so much happened that year. And somehow that failed to enter the classroom. And I was one of the only person of color in that classroom. I felt so disengaged from the program. I still continue the practice because I find them supportive, but I didn't feel a sense of community. I didn't feel a sense of belonging. I really began to check out of the program. Like I would come, I would participate as much as I can. I'll do the practice at home, but it was almost like just kind of get through this A versus like really immerse yourself in this program. So bringing in things that are happening in these different communities, which may require us to educate ourselves around what's happening in these different communities. So the more, what you get on the headlines may not necessarily be about these communities. So you may have to do a little bit of deep searching for it. But the more we understand the cultural context that these folks are living through in a moment like this, especially in this country right now in the USA, like how does that not come in? And for me, week 2 and MBSR specifically, like 9 dots, perceptions has always been a really important place to bring in that perspective around race, racism, identities through the lens of awareness. So there's a lot of space in these curriculums to bring these ideas into the room, but I just don't think it happens because there's some hesitation by teachers of being uncomfortable holding a space like that. And then part of it is just there's not enough knowledge. So it's rather like, let me just avoid it and not touch it rather than take a risk of making a mistake.
Which is interesting because mindfulness is about turning towards what is here, and there is still this habit around avoidance.
Yeah.
And it may not be a willful avoidance. It can be an innocent just not recognizing, oh, I haven't really been paying attention to what the participants who are in my group may actually be going through
Yeah.
that brought them to this in the first place. Yeah.
No, I'll add just one thing to that from my own experience because, othering or oppression isn't just about race. It could happen in a variety of categories: socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation. And a lot of my own internal work as an instructor, because it's very easy to see where maybe there's oppression happening in my direction or where I'm the other, but also important for me as a person of color still to notice where maybe I have positions of privilege that I need to be aware of where maybe I'm putting others in that predicament. And, for someone raised in a very Christian religious household, religious culture where perception around the LGBTQ plus community hasn't always been a pleasant one, it required a lot of internal work from me. And part of that internal work included like going to yoga classes specifically for LGBT communities and allies, finding myself continuously in spaces where I'm sort of the majority of the dominant culture as a heterosexual person. But what is it like when I step into a room full of LGBTQ plus communities, transgender community, and the discomfort I need to work with in relation to that? But that's been a great teacher for me and has allowed me to be in space and to hold space where I may not fully understand what it means to be from that community, but being educated and being present to that community has really allowed me in a lot of ways to be more dynamic as an instructor rather than this heterosexual person. And this is the only conditioning I know around sexuality.
Yeah, it's so important, this idea of the different ways in which bias shows up, that we may typically in the US think of things like racism or gender identity or identification or others. There's just so many different ways in which we can disconnect, finding ways in which we can connect. And that doesn't mean that I have to become a part of someone else's culture or engage. That's cultural appropriation is what that can lead to, rather than cultural appreciation. I don't have to be part of this to think, wow, that's really awesome. That's not something that's been part of my background, but what an amazing thing. How terrific that is. Can we celebrate that and support each other even when it's not us? I think that's one of the most important things, and why it's critical for people who do look more like me to also be part of. No, you have to be part of the solution. It's not something that you can only have people who are in the global majority working on. It's also for people who are in and enjoying privilege that may be unearned simply by virtue of how we look. Okay, so with some of those challenges, what are some of the opportunities? How do we shift
Can
the
I,
direction of this?
before we move there, can I just say
Yeah,
a little bit around, because I shared for participants, but like what would be supportive for teachers of
yeah,
color to
please.
be in this
Yeah.
space? And this is something we have done really well at Brown and that I'm quite proud of is supporting those who wanted to work in historically marginalized communities in their teacher training. And this meant like scholarships. This meant how do we give a variety of options for retreats instead of only 7 days? Can we offer like 2 3 day retreats as a way to support them because it's not maybe feasible for them to take a week of? So really considering, so as we look at different teacher training programs, whether that's MBSR or something else, are we really considering, is this really available to someone with a full-time job who doesn't have support in taking care of their children? So how do we program teacher trainings with that in mind, knowing that these communities may not have the same resources that were not factored in when this training was initially created? So I think looking at the training and the way it's set up is an important place to support marginalized folks. And then also, is the material relatable to teacher trainers? Because often these programs were created years ago by folks who were not part of that community, where not much consultation was brought in from that community in terms of creating this curriculum. Of course, we're seeing with MBSR now, as we're making some of the changes to it, there's been a lot more interest bringing voices from a variety of different angles to make sure that this is a culturally and trauma sensitive informed curriculum, which is something I think all curriculums need to reckon with. Like, are we looking at it in depth? And are we looking at it and saying, is this really set up to address the needs of everyone and not just one specific group? So that feels like an important place for us to reflect on. And then when we invite teachers of color into training, into conferences, into conventions and things like that, are we just inviting them to say there's diversity in the room? Are we just checking off boxes? Or are we actually giving them meaningful space and opportunity for their words to actually influence the direction of what we're trying to build here as a community? Because I find myself in a lot of these spaces because of my affiliation to these different institutions, but often it feels like lip service, to be honest with you, Ted. Like, oh, here, we got a Black person in this program, in this training, but that's the extent of how far things have shifted, but there's nothing beyond that. So how do we meaningfully invite people into spaces and then give them room at that table for them to have their voices heard as well?
Yeah, I would even take it a step further, is the perspective of it's not just an invitation and making space. That's still from a position of privilege. That it is actively creating that and co-developing it with people who have not been in these spaces as being in genuine leadership positions with actual direction setting ability. We're not seeing that a lot. It's still
No.
very, I think, performative. And we're
Yeah.
saying, oh, but look, we have this. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's that's a checkbox. That's tokenism. That's not actually inclusiveness in these communities.
No, you're absolutely right. I think part of it is just there's the not knowing how to do this skillfully. Part of it, I think there's fear of making mistakes. Listen, we're if we've never made a mistake in this practice, we haven't taken any meaningful risks. So there are going to be opportunities where you will run into a wall, you will make a mistake, you will step on someone's toes. But if we don't have the space to have meaningful conversation and dialogues about these really important topics, instead, we're all kind of walking on eggshells, hoping not to offend someone else, then nothing meaningfully shifts. We just really play safe at the corners of the room, but no one's actually invited to the center. So I tell my colleagues, like, there's space for me to be in conversation with you about these things. If there's sincerity, if there's true commitment and dedication, I don't want the responsibility of educating everyone I come across on this topic. And at the same time, I also have to look at it and say, what bandwidth and capacity do I have to make space for this conversation, especially for folks who are sincere about putting this into action?
Yeah, and that's a very critical point is that people in the global majority are not responsible for educating everyone else about the experiences in what are typically white spaces.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel it's important for me to be in relationship with folks who are actually sincere about doing this work. Same way, I step into these other communities where I don't know so much about it, and I'm asking with kindness and both through my effort that I am sincerely interested in learning about your culture. Like, I have space for that. I just don't have space for tell me everything I need to know. That way I could turn around and spit that back out to the next community of folks that I'm teaching.
Yeah, here's the book. I'm not
Yeah,
going to read it to you, but here's the
exactly.
book. Okay, so let's talk. I think this is a nice segue into more of the how do we turn this around? What are some of the things that you would like to see in the next few years that's different from how they are now? What does that look like when we know, we made a difference?
I think the first thing is what's happening right now, Ted. This conversation we're having, I think of this as planting the seed. If we're not talking about things, if we're not bringing them to the center of our conversation, then they don't have any opportunity to be seen. We talk about awareness, like we shine a spotlight on something so we can see it clearly. So here's our skillful way of bringing our practice into this conversation and saying, this is what I'm experiencing as a Black man who's in this mindfulness and yoga space. These are some of the challenges I'm having. So having even the platform to talk about it, I think in so many ways is a good starting point. And then to follow up on it, as some of the things that we already mentioned and expanding on it is, okay, if we're sincere about making sure there's space for marginalized communities, the global majority, whether it's from a teacher perspective or participant perspective, like, are we inviting them, one, not at the end of the ride, but at the beginning? So not after we've made all the decisions, not after we've decided everything's going to be and say, here you go, like you can have it now. So if we actually want to see meaningful change in this field, then we need to board on platform A and not platform Z on this ride. So how do we skillfully invite folks to be in conversation into program development and curriculum development, teacher trainings? I think that's an important place to really make some changes. And then also, how do we, I don't know if this is a training, I don't know if this is built into the curriculum, but I believe cultural humility is an important part of being a mindfulness instructor. And I think it's a place that many of us haven't truly examined. So, is it a specific kind of training for mindfulness teachers who are interested in really evolve? And there's no way to train everyone about everything, but can we plant the seeds of what are the things we can do? What are ways we can educate ourselves? What are ways we can bring different voices into a room? How do we center a voice that doesn't look like ours? So I think there has to be some level of training that is important, because I see, as someone who's also does teacher certification reviews for folks at the end of their teacher training pathway, I get to watch recordings of different teachers, especially relatively new teachers going up for full certification and so on. And then there's places I wish that there was some education around different topics relating to DIB, that even their teaching would be showing up differently. I think the impact they would have on the people in their room would show up differently. Even if it's all white people that they're teaching, I think having cultural humility can begin to plant the seeds of perspective, not only for themselves, but for all the people who come in and out of their classrooms on a regular basis. So I think I would say for participants on the other side is we need just to have more teachers of color. We're seeing the more teachers of color in front of the room, the more likely a person of color will enter that space. So sometimes it's simple as how do we create more teachers of color? And then how do we support them? And this may have to be like scholarships so they could go to teacher training. How do we adapt curriculums or training cycles so they can actually attend these trainings? Because a lot of the work I'm doing now is offering things on Saturdays because I know folks can't take it in the middle of a work day, or offering things really like later in the evening or super early in the morning so they don't have to take time off from work to participate. So how do we meet people that are not the dominant culture who generally speaking, this is not always true, have more resources to work with. So like, oh, maybe I can't take PTO from work and attend this training. That's not a lived experience for many people in my community. So having a training at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, you already eliminated most people from that community. So even just logistically, how we offer it and when we offer becomes a big part of accessibility.
Yeah, and that's such a huge point because people don't always realize not everyone has the ability to take standard hours to do things. It's why
Yeah.
whenever I teach MBSR, it's on the weekend
Yeah.
because that's when most people can attend this stuff. And at a time where it's accessible to most of the people who would want to attend, whether
Yeah.
they're somewhere in a very different time zone than me or they're right where I am, they can attend. And that's such a small thing to be able to do that makes such a huge difference for people
Yeah.
coming in. And as you're talking about teaching, this is, I think, one of the fundamental shifts that's starting to get a groundswell right now is that people who follow various channels I'm on have seen me say we don't teach teachers, we teach programs.
Yeah.
And so people learn a curriculum, whatever it happens to be, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is not against that. It's that what we're missing is certain areas that are necessary for someone to be able to be the kind of teachers we've been describing, that include learning about ethics that was not explicitly taught in our program training. Things like cultural awareness, things like trauma sensitivity or neurodiversity, or so many different aspects that come into who you are as a teacher, and that not everyone is teaching full 8 week programs.
Yeah.
And they still need these capacities. So much more to come on that. I'm hoping we can have another conversation about that sometime.
Yeah. One thing I'll say to that, when something I'm really happy at Brown is all these. So initially, there's this teacher training pathway, but over the last few years, these shorter programs have been implemented, whether it's like the Buddhist underpinnings, trauma and sensitivity, belonging, like all of that is starting to get folded as part of the teacher training pathway for folks coming through this Brown system. So I think there is some leg to it. And I'm hoping that also becomes a thing, not just at Brown, but all these other institutions who are offering mindfulness intervention training is how do we not just teach the curriculum, but all the other phases of what it means to be a complete human being who's offering this thing to a certain group of folks. So it feels like there is some traction there, and I'm hoping that becomes the norm and not the exception.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, winding up with one last question. What have we not talked about yet that you want to, that's really moving you to speak about?
I think like the framing of mindfulness in the West can often have a very individualistic lens. And when we talk about the operational definition of mindfulness, the part that most people often would allude to is here's awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and judgmentally. So that's often as far as we take the definition of mindfulness. But to me, even if you look at the MBSR curriculum, there's like a second part of that definition. John says, if needed, in service of wisdom, self-understanding, recognizing our intrinsic connectedness with others and with the world. So it really brings in, I don't know, did I freeze up?
You're okay.
Okay.
You keep going.
So I lost my train of thought, but with that definition, the one often whenever people talk about mindfulness, it's really that, to me, an incomplete and limited definition. And we'd rarely ever talk about the second part of the definition. that this is a practice of community. This is a relational practice of being with one another. This is not just about, oh, I'm stressed at work. Yes, that may be why you came into the class. And then we are seeing there's a lot bigger, more connectivity than just that isolated problem that brought you into this space. So I think when we talk about how do we make this offering to the global majority, a big part of that is highlighting that this is not just a practice of self-preservation or just our own well-being, but this is also a practice of community. And that framework has really resonated with the communities that I work with. So whenever I give the definition of mindfulness, it's always important for me to add the second piece that John mentions in the curriculum, that it's not just about our own well-being, but it's a much larger process, a much bigger practice than that. So I just want to, yeah, it doesn't get talked about enough. So for me, coming from a community-oriented approach, that piece feels really a significant and missed opportunity quite often in mindfulness spaces.
Yeah, I agree with you because so much of this has had the stance and perspective of navel gazing on a mountaintop. And while that's not a wrong thing, and you can do that, and they may be very helpful to yourself, it has more life and energy when it is an embedded, interconnective way of being.
Mm.
I agree. That's often what's missing.
Yeah, and that part it comes really alive for the global majority because a lot of our ways of healing has always been through the lens of community. I was telling folks like in my culture, when there's grieving, everybody comes together and cries together. And that in itself is where the healing begins. Versus if I'm just staying at home, and I mean, each culture has their own ways of doing, so I'm not creating a hierarchy around it. But I know this conversation about how do we support these different communities, and to me, positioning mindfulness as a community-based practice is a really an important way to frame it for these communities.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, for those who are watching or listening, I will have some links where links are found in whatever channel you're using for this. I want to thank our guest today, Abraham Dejene. Abe, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ted, for having me.
Thank you so much for being here and hope you enjoyed this episode. Please do remember to tap that subscribe button if this was meaningful to you in some way. And feel free to comment on this post as well. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. And I'll see you again soon on Mindfulness Voyage.